and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for coming to this event today. You are at the Manzano Mountain Art Council. We are a nonprofit. We work for the community. We put on lectures, we put on dances. We have after-school programs which are very involved. And I want to tell you that today's program was brought to you by the New Mexico Arts, which is a division of the Department of Cultural Affairs. So let me tell you a little bit about a very driven young man. Come out here.
Trying to stay in the chat.
This is Alex Arnold. He works for Salinas, Pueblo Missions, which is our national park right here in Mount Airy, New Mexico. He's 25 years old. He's quite driven. I want you to understand that this young man started volunteering at the age of 13. He was driven back then. He will go further up the line in the National Park Service. He obtained a BA in history with minors in event planning and tourism. And his studies of BA. He was a seasonal park ranger at 5 different national parks. And he's, oh yes, 25 years old. I want you to remember that. How many young people today do you know that are driven from the time they are 13 to know what they want? This is a young man that will teach you a great many things today. Please help me in welcoming Alex Arnold from the National Park Service.
Well, thank you, Miss Donna. I couldn't ask for anybody better to give me an introduction there. Let me know if I'm standing too close or too far away from this. I'm trying to have a happy medium there, and I like to wander around, so I'm going to have to turn like this. But at any rate, welcome everyone to Mountain Air. And just curious, is there anybody, this is the first time that you've been in this town? Raise your hand. We got a good group back there. Okay, yeah, so we have some first timers, and then of course we have some locals, which I'm spotting in the audience there. And then we have some of our own volunteers here from the park that some are right out and about and others are hiding behind some top cover clothing there. So I won't call you out since you're trying to be incognito. So. All right, so today we're going to be focusing, this is very much a human story. It's a people story. So we're focusing on the people of central New Mexico. And of course the people that lived and inhabited the region in and around the park, Salinas, Pueblo Missions. So I've titled it Diversity in the Heart of New Mexico, because if you notice on the map, we are smack dab in the middle of New Mexico. I say in the middle of everything, although some people might contest that, but we are right in the heart of New Mexico, and there's no denying that. Donna gave a good background on me, so I could skip this slide. Okay, so about us, about the National Park Service and where we came from. Originally, Gran Quivira, which is our southernmost unit, about 25 minutes down South 55, it was formed originally in 1909. So it predates the National Park Service by about 7 years. And it was originally created under the Antiquities Act and signed into existence by President Taft. So originally it was called Gran Quivira National Monument, so it's been a long staple of this community. And then later, the federal government acquired two additional sites, Abo and Porine, which are right here, from the state of New Mexico. And in 1980, legislation was passed to create Salinas National Monument, and then it dissolved Gran Quivira National Monument, and it became one. So that's when, and then in 1988, we were later renamed to what we are today, Salinas Pueblo Missions National Monument, to better reflect what our story is here. So where are we? Where are you? You have to know somewhat where you are because you're here. But we are right here, smack dab in the center of the state. We've got our 3 units there, and we're sort of in the middle of, about right there. We're situated in Torrance and part of Socorro County in the Estancia Basin. The Estancia Basin is sort of encapsulates this whole region that's between the Manzano Mountains, the Chupadero Mesa, as well as the Pino Mountains, which are out to the west beyond Abo Pass. Florai is our northernmost unit, Abo is our westernmost, and Gran Quadira is our southernmost unit. And you're going to hear a little bit about each of those today in the presentation. So the peopling of the Estancia Basin. So the early evidence of people comes at about 6,000 BC, and that's with the Paleo Indians that moved through Abo Pass to hunt. Abo Pass has been used as a thoroughfare of people since this 6,000 BC, and today some of you might have come from I-25 across Route 60. That goes straight through the Abo Pass region. And you were traveling on a road that's been traveled for centuries, and all the way through the railroad and through Native Americans that had walked through the pass to trade, and then you today in your vehicles to come here. It's the most direct route. People are people. They do the path of least resistance. The next era of people that lived here were the ancestral Pueblo people, and they settled here about as early as 800. And we're going to be a little vague on these because we're going to explore each group individually in the next coming slides. The Pueblo people were the next group, so we're talking Pueblo 3 and Pueblo 4 era. They established more permanent settlements and were advancing in farming that they began during that ancestral Puebloan era, which is also referred to in some circles as the Anasazi era, but today we refer to it as ancestral Pueblo. Spanish exploration in this region begins in 1580, a little bit later than the earliest. The mission system enters in at 1613 in Chile. Migration of Spanish and Pueblo people from the region occur by 1679, and then resettlement returns to the region in circa 1815. So convergence of native culture. We are certainly in a crossroads of people where we are here today. So this map here just represents the more sedentary groups of people. Now when we say sedentary, we don't necessarily mean people are living in the same place their entire lives. We mean they're there for a long portion of time, maybe a couple hundred years, and then they might migrate, leave for 50 years, they might come back. It all depends on what the resources are, but they are not nomadic plains people, which are a much different culture. So with that being said, the plains culture also inhabits all of this region in here. They are in more temporary camps. They're moving through the area to hunt, collect resources, and to trade. So this map is just representative of those more sedentary agricultural groups. You have the ancestral Pueblo culture, which is what you're familiar with in the Four Corners region. That domain stretches all the way down to this region. You have the Mogollon culture, which stretches all the way down into Mexico, and then you have the Hohokam, which is out in Arizona, which is sites, if you think of like Tonto National Monument, some of the cliff dwellings out in Casa Grande, out in that region. But take a look on this map where we are. I highlighted Mountain Air. We're right there in the middle of the state. You see two lines coming together there. That's important to look at because we'll be talking a little bit about our Gran Quadira site today. And Gran Quadira is considered one of the southernmost, the most significant southernmost ancestral Pueblo site, one that's consistent with Pueblo culture. Anything to the south of that, in the Tularosa Basin, so that's White Sands and just to the north, that is all considered the Mogollon culture, as far as you can see there on the map. Gran Quadira has aspects of both, and it really depends on what time period you're in to see which one is more consistent, which one is more prevalent and predominant. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. And here's just a quick timeline to put it into perspective for you all. So they have listed Anasazi or ancestral Pueblo. Their ancestors, they're basket makers, basket maker 1 to the San Jose. This goes all the way back into the early Paleo people. And then you got Pueblo 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So what we're focusing on today will be Pueblo 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are going to be our main periods of inhabitation that are significant at our park specifically. And one important thing to note, you see the Mogollon culture, how it's broken down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you notice it ends at 5. So that's an interesting point there that the Mogollon culture starts to phase out once we get to roughly about 11 or 1200. This is diagonal because there's not quite a consensus or uniformity throughout the entire group of people. But we notice in the southern domain of the ancestral Pueblo world that the influence of the Mogollon people starts to be more prevalent once you get to this era, especially about 1400. So there's strong evidence to show that these people phased in with the southern ancestral Pueblo cultures, which is why you see this timeline explaining Pueblo 3 and Pueblo 4 in the Mogollon culture, because they had integrated in and phased in with those Pueblo cultures. So the ancestral Pueblo people, this is primarily Pueblo 1 and Pueblo 2 and into Pueblo 3. The evidence of occupation is at Abo and Gran Quivira primarily. They lived in pit houses from roughly 800 AD to 1000 AD. Gran Quivira, there were at least 9 pit house foundations identified. And then once you get to about 1000 to 1200 AD, they are moving into what are called Hakal structures. I have examples of both of them here, but we're going to dive into them a little bit more a couple slides down. So the pit houses at Gran Quivira, their roofs were supported by 4 rectangular posts, so these posts held up the roof structure. They were oftentimes subterranean. The access came through the roof, not the antechamber. So the pit houses would, if we go back to the last slide here. If you see the pit houses, they sometimes have an antechamber here. Usually in the Four Corners region, you'll see the entrances come through the antechamber rather than the main chamber, because there was a fireplace coming, or well, not a fireplace, more so a smoke chamber with a fire there. The ones at Gran Quivira, the entrances were not through the antechamber, they were through where the smoke hole would be. This depicts the 4 roof beams, and it would be very similar to that, so they were freestanding vertical square posts that were holding up the structure. They would have a hakal base, meaning it would have basically juniper trees that were tied together with some sort of twine or fabric or yucca fibers that would tie these together, and then they would pack it with packed earth to form a protective layer on the outside. Like I mentioned, they would usually have a fire hearth in here, which the entrance to their dwellings would serve as a smoke hole to let smoke out. At Gran Quivira, during the archaeology in the 1950s, they excavated one pit house structure that had 165 potsherds that were collected and analyzed. In that, 79% of that were Nana brown. So pottery helps archaeologists and historians tell a story of when these people were there, roughly how many people were there. Was this a residence, or was this something that served a separate purpose? And the actual type of pottery, where it came from, how much was local compared to how much was foreign, because that would tell you how much contact the site had with outside societies, and maybe give you a clue when you're looking at other types of things like petroglyphs, pictographs, plastering, plaster art, that will give you sort of an idea maybe where they got some of their techniques from. So 79% were Nana brown. That comes from the Ornata Mogollon people, which are in the Tularosa Basin, part of that Mogollon society. So you see, 79% of it was that. So they had quite a good bit of contact with the Mogollon people. Then we also look at 6 to 7% was that Lino Gray. That comes from southwestern Colorado, northwestern New Mexico, northern Arizona, Four Corners region. And then the remainder was unidentified brownware that was too small or just couldn't be analyzed. So the point of this is that the dwellings are strongly tied to the ancestral Pueblo people. They're the same type of pit houses that you would see all the way up to the north in Mesa Verde. However, the pottery style is more consistent with the Mogollon culture, which is that society to the south. So obviously those two groups had a lot of cultural exchange, cultural borrowing back and forth between one another. So the Hakal characteristics. These were isolated individual or dual rooms. If anybody's from the East Coast, they're actually very similar to longhouses that the Iroquois or some of the other woodland people had over in that region. But same base, it was that Hakal stacked juniper or pinyon pine. And then the difference being there would have been a thicker layer of plastering on the outside. There would have been an adobe style plaster rather than that just packed earth plaster. So they're starting to change the way that they're building, and that's a lot of influence coming down from the north. If you look at the years that people were living in Hakals in this region compared to what people were living in Hakals in the Four Corners region, we're much later. We're about 200 years, give or take, behind what the Four Corners region are doing. Now that's not to say the word didn't make it down here. They might, as I mentioned, it's very much a human story. They might have just been, well, these are working. We're not really going to tear them down and build something new. But oftentimes you would see these exist together. So you would have, a cluster. You would have, maybe 2 or 3 Hakals here, and then you would have a cluster of pit houses here. And then in Great Quivira, interestingly enough, they found that they actually had a transition period where they were building in this Hakal style. However, they were putting some of the gray limestone to be additional siding onto the structures, but they were shaped like a Hakal, and they were designed like a Hakal in these single room blocks. So that's happening around 1150 to 1200 at Great Quivira. So the ceramics found, they found Chupadero black on white, and this is at Great Quivira. Chupadero black on white, that's the predominant style that you'll see produced around here. It's a type of grayware that's painted, and it has different patterns on it, spiral patterns, diamond patterns, things like that. And that was produced widely throughout, roughly from 1100 through 1400. You have the Corona corrugated. That's a local style. That is Tupperware, basically. So that is Tupperware from this era, and you'll see it everywhere. And it's called corrugated because it has small little corrugations on it, little ridges on it. But interestingly enough, just a side tangent, there were different patterns of corrugations depending on what area you were in or what time period you were in. So they actually had a type of decorated corrugation where it would be, zigzagged or in some sort of artistic pattern. So it shows it was fancy Tupperware too. Some of that could get expensive, so I can see that. Okay, next we got more of that Ornata brown. So it still shows a tight cultural connection. Wingate black on red, that comes from west central New Mexico, eastern Arizona. And St. John's black on red from the White Mountains in Arizona. That was a common type found. It was found in the Four Corners region. It was widely distributed, and it also made its way down through here. It's one of the most common thorian types of pottery you'll find at these sites. Okay, so now we're in the bulk of the native era at the park, pre-Spanish contact, leading up to Spanish contact. So this is Pueblo 3 and 4, circa 1100 through 1600. So you got different language groups that are shown on this map here. This era is what you more so would see if you go to some of the contemporary pueblos that have traditional areas such as Taos or Acoma. These were masonry structures used with local stone. local red sandstone, gray limestone, whatever was available. They had adobe style plaster. Some of them had white plaster of lime or gypsum. And they were usually between 1 and 3 stories from the records that we have. The language group here, Abel and Gran Quivira spoke Tompiro, which is sort of this little cluster that you see down here. This little cluster was sort of more like this, actually. And then Huarai spoke Tiwa. Huarai was actually the southernmost southern Tiwa, and it's a widely spoken language. It's still spoken to this day. But this was the southern Tiwas, and then there was a central group of Tiwas near Albuquerque, and then there was the northern Tiwas, which is up in Taos, and it's still spoken today. So the culture, what's the culture like? So Kivas were the native worship areas for ceremonies. The earliest reference that was written of the way that the Tompiro went about spiritual ceremonies comes from Diego Perez de Luxon in 1583. That Pueblo referencing Tenebo, which is a Pueblo about 3.5 miles from Abo, had 4 caverns in the plazas where they have their dances and their baths, and the places served as a community center and lodging place for strangers. In front of each one, outside the entrance, is a black stone, 4 fingers in thickness, 3 spans wide, and 1 estados above the ground. And on each kiva is a badly painted figure of an Indian with a flaming crown. Everyone has one of these idols in his house. So as rough around the edges as that statement was, it does give you a little bit of an insight that the culture was consistent with the greater ancestral Pueblo, the greater ancestral Pueblo culture of kivas and kachinas. They wore hides of animals, cotton blankets, and furs. The eastern Tompiras at Gran Quivira, you'll see them referred to as the Humanos, which are traditionally a plains group that hails in western Texas. They had great contact with them. They wore striped paint across their noses and faces, which that's something that was done by the true plains Humano people. So there's some more cultural borrowing that comes from the Humano people. It's not 100% known why they've done that, or if they were actually true plains Humano people that integrated in with a small group of Tompiro Pueblo people. But nonetheless, that the culture at Gran Quivira utilized that plains custom of face painting. Effigies, you'll see mountain lions, birds, frogs, bobcats, a little bit of everything. Kiva D at Gran Quivira. So this kiva was researched in the 1950s, and this structure is about 17 feet deep, 6 to 7 feet subterranean, or 17 feet in diameter, 6 to 7 feet deep. It had a roof. It was supported by 4 posts, which are depicted here, but no remnants of the roof was found in the fill material that was in the bottom of the kiva. And there was a fireplace in the center, 5 to 6 feet in diameter. And there's a rendition of what Kiva D looked like. Kiva art, I mentioned plaster. In the public study that was conducted at Gran Quivira, they were able to preserve some of the early parts of the kiva art that was found within the kivas. Now, most of them at Gran Quivira had many layers of plaster. Some of them numbered over 30 in some cases. I believe Kiva N, the one down here, I think it had 32 layers of plaster in it. And some of those were utilitarian, or they were just basically there for structural support or integrity. And then some of them were artistic, having artwork depicting culturally significant things of the people that lived there. Weapons and tools. So the Espejo edition in the 1580s, which was the first expedition here in the Salinas area, the weapons, so this was a quote from that expedition, the weapons which they bear are a small bow, arrows, a cowhide or a bison hide, shield, wooden and stone bludgeons loaded at the end. These people are more warlike than those formerly encountered, the Piros. So this is most likely referring to the Tompiro people out at Tabo or somewhere within the Abo Pass. As they were moving up from Socorro, the Piro and the Tompiro cultures were very closely related, their languages coming from one another. They had arrow shaft straighteners, club heads, griddles, matates, grinding stones, paint grinding slabs, hammer stones, mortar and pestles, projectile points, axe heads. And most of this material was made of local stone, limestone, sandstone, and basalt at Gran Quivira. And then arrowheads were chalcedony, jasper, obsidian, chert, quartzite, and flint. The flint most likely came from Texas, and then the obsidian most likely was brought in from the Jemez region. Other notable artifacts, and if you stop by the Gran Quivira Museum in summertime when it opens, you'll get to see some of this. This is where these photos were taken. But they were things made from bone, so wind instruments, beads, pendants, needles, scraping tools, owls, scrapers. The bone type came from jackrabbits, coyotes, mule deer, white-tailed deer, pronghorn, bison, golden eagle, etc., red-tailed hawk, turkey. There were different types of beads as well that came from different types of bone. There's gray wolf, osprey, great horned owl, bald eagle, Mexican duck, prairie falcon, and ravens. So you see a wide variety of things being used, and some things that aren't, traditionally found here that often. White-tailed deer is one, and it kind of shows a difference in time period. They might have been ranging here a lot more often than they do, today. Architecture. So Mound 7 at Gran Quivira, it was nearly continuously inhabited for about 400 years. It's broken down into 3 building phases. You got the early phase, middle phase, late phase. The early phase, they had more circular fire pits. They had trough patates, full grooved axes. The pottery styles were Corona corrugated, and the Chupadera black on white. Middle phase, 1400, 1550, you got the rectangular fire pits. You have the spiral grooved axes that were introduced. And then the Corona planeware and the Chupadera black on white is still continuing to be produced. Late phase, you have rectangular slabs, slab metate, spiral groove, Corona plane, same old. But then you also have Tabira black on white, which phases out Chupadera black on white. Now the Tabira black on white is very similar, except that it depicts symbols now. You'll see people, you'll see turkey feathers. If they had Spanish contact, you may see crosses. Whereas the Chupadera black on white, all you saw in those were more of the patterns, so spirals and diamonds and things like that. They also started producing polychromes, and they had a Tabira polychrome style that was similar. And then this just kind of shows the building phases of the middle phase building. So the original Mound 7 Pueblo was built in a circular style, which was very common for the earlier masonry structures throughout the Southwest. And then they started building more in that rectangular style with connected room blocks together. And then you sort of see them start to stagger it. And then you can also tell when the population might have increased. So, we're looking at more people. And when you look at the time period, that's that middle phase, 1400 to 1550. And remember, I referenced the Mogollon Society starts to phase out by this time, and people start to migrate. So it's interesting to see Gran Quivira have a rapid building phase during that same period of sort of the depopulation of a certain area, which probably indicates a lot of the folks started migrating to the north and integrating in with ancestral Pueblo. The Spanish arrived, so in come the Spanish. Remember, this was all pre-contact. So the first mission to be established between the 3 sites is at Abo. It was established in 1622, and there were roughly 500 Tompiro people living there at that time, which that is this beautiful site up here. Now, you all have to go to the sites because you're here for this, so then you have to go to the sites afterwards. That's a requirement, I think. Yeah, that's that, and you have to take pictures. So that's that beautiful site there. Then we have Korai. 1626, there were about 400 Tiwa people living there at that time. That population stayed pretty steady. And that's this beautiful site right here, which is most people's favorite because it has the most complete church remnants that are left. And then you have Gran Quivira, right down there at the bottom. Beautiful site, a little bit further south of town. That mission was founded in 1629 with roughly 1,500 Tompiro in the Pueblo. There were quite a lot of people at Gran Quivira. The Spanish, we see records from anywhere from 1,500 people to 3,000 people. And we think that population swings so much because of the contact they have with the plains groups. At certain times, there was friendly trade between the Pueblo people and certain bands of Apache. And then also you have consistently good trade relationships with the Umano people. So you probably would have had them camping and staying in the area. So the Spanish probably observed population swings at Gran Quivira, which is probably most likely why they give us such a wide range when we read their records. The mission church layout. So a lot of folks don't realize the Bow actually had two churches. I referenced the number 500, and this church right here was built. This church in Convento was built to withstand a population, or to serve a population of about 500 people. It's your continuous nave transept style. And then the Convento here was basically your hub of the mission, your business hub per se, where you would have your kitchen, your dining room, your sacristy, the alcoves and rooms for the priests and the lay brothers and the friars. And then this church, this is circa 1630, this church was completed in 27, and then you get this larger church that was built in 1651, and the pure reason for that is because the population grows from 500 to 1,400 by that time. So you have to have a larger church to withstand more people. So you also see an expansion of the convento, and this was the final expansion. Dining room, kitchen, the alcoves and rooms of the friars, the porteria entrance. You have your sacristy storeroom, and various other the corral, and then the stables for the farming operations of the mission. Next you have Korai, and this is depicting the Korai as you see it today. It went through 3 renovations of the convento, but you see it's a continuous nave transept. The interesting thing about, and I missed this, the interesting thing about Bow is that there were actually 5 altars. There's a side altar, side altar, side altar, side altar, main altar. These 2 side altars could be partitioned off, and there was actually a catwalk that would connect 2 balconies that were above these side altars. Bow is actually the only church that has that example pre-Pueblo revolt in New Mexico, and it's more so shaped like a key if you look at it, rather than a true cross shape. So Bow's pretty unique. Korai is more typical of what you see, just 2 side altars and then the raised main altar. Front entrance coming through here with the Campo Santo here, or cemetery entrance to the convento, open air porch, and then Bow and Korai had a kiva that was within the convento, and you remember I referenced kiva as being spiritual places for the native peoples. So it's interesting to see that there were kivas right in the middle of the conventos, of the Spanish Franciscan Church conventos. Well, the archaeology shows that they most likely were built when the churches were built, and especially using Bow as an example, because Bow is built on undisturbed soil. There were no uninhabited pueblos that were sitting underneath Bow. So the archaeology is interesting. within the conventos, the kivas and the conventos at the site, we found both crucifixes as well as effigies that were consistent with both Catholic and Pueblo spiritual ceremonies. So what we could gather from that, there's a consensus view that most likely those kivas were built to integrate natives into a new worship style by giving them a familiar place to start, or a familiar place to listen and observe and to phase them into a new style of worship. That would be semi-consistent with the policy for a while. The Spanish, the Franciscans allowed kiva worship until you get to the 1650s, when they outlaw the kiva ceremonies and start filling in kivas. There's a complete policy shift there. So that, of course, comes much, much later once you get into the late 1650s and the 1660s. So it would match up with the policy, but that's still one that's a little bit of a mystery of why there was kivas in the middle of the convento, but that's our best theory that we could gather by what was left behind. Then there's Gran Quivira. Gran Quivira has two churches that you can actually still see today. The first church of San Isidro, which is actually San Buenaventura I. It was dedicated to San Buenaventura. It had planned to be dedicated to Isidro, so that one you'll see it referenced as both. I always call it San Buenaventura I, but nobody else does, so I call it San Isidro. So this is a little church, but just look how much the Pueblo dwarfs the church. It's pretty amazing. The Campo Santo come out the front. This was the main church used at Gran Quivira, and most likely because Gran Quivira was downgraded to a visita, which means it was a mission that did not have a resident friar. The friar at Abo, Acevedo, would perform the masses at Gran Quivira. He would make a pilgrimage. So they only had just a small church at Gran Quivira, and then when it was upgraded back to a mission, they said, well, we have, almost 2,000 people, we need to build a bigger church. So then they start building San Buenaventura, or San Buenaventura II, with the full-size convento, which is a very similar setup with the residencies and dining room, kitchen, sacristy, sacristy storeroom. So, which it's comparable to the size of Mound 7, probably a little bit smaller still then. So it just shows, the building techniques and styles of the Pueblo people were really advanced, and they built some magnificent structures in the region. The mission system in general, and this is in New Mexico, the ecclesiastical headquarters is in Santo Domingo. The missions were the ones, as I mentioned, were the ones that had resident friar or friars, depending on how big. Visitas did not have a resident friar, but were administered by a friar at a neighboring mission. I mentioned Acevedo. He was the visiting friar to Gran Quivira, Tabira, and Tenebo. He was a busy person. Friars were assisted by lay brothers to oversee daily tasks, preparation of mass, and supply inventories. So supplies. The Spanish actually kept pretty decent records, so we know exactly what was needed to start a mission. So we have that information in case you ever need that for a 1600s mission. There you go. So there were 10 axes, 3 adze for trimming beams. There were 10 hoes for gardens, 1 medium-sized saw, 1 chisel, 2 augers, 1 box plane, 600 tin nails for a church door, 64-inch nails, 67-inch nails, 100 nails, and 400 common nails of unknown size and weight. There you go. That's all you need. Crops to grow, you have wheat, cereal grains, apples, corn, beans, squash. Corn, beans, and squash were already native. That's what the Native Americans were farming prior to the Spanish coming here. Livestock to raise, sheep, cattle, goats, horses, chicken, turkey, and mules. Chickens were the road snacks. They were the ones that were easy to eat along the way. And then any ones that were left, they were just left behind to integrate into the herd, into the mission herd. So you'd have had a few chickens running around. And then turkey were actually already being raised by the Pueblo people. A specific type of turkey, though, called the small Pueblo turkey, that specific variation actually does not exist anymore. It was lost, it was phased out, but they had the small Pueblo turkey. They were just smaller. And they wouldn't eat them. They typically would use them for ceremonial purposes, use their feathers. You see them depicted in petroglyphs and pottery, and they were culturally significant to them. Mission, school, and trades. So there were trades and classes within the conventos. There were carpentry, weaving. They taught Latin, stoneworking, blacksmithing, religious theory, Spanish language, of course. And native youth would fulfill roles like porters, gardeners, interpreters, waiters, sacristans, choir leaders and members, bell ringer, organist, herdsman, cook, horse tender, and gardener. So those were typical roles that native youth would fulfill. And the tensions, they start to boil, of course. Now remember, this was all happening pre-Pueblo revolt, so pre-1680. Food scarcity sets in. So there was a large-scale drought from 1667 to 1672. In 1668 alone, 450 people died from malnourishment or from the drought. This led to an increase in raids from hostile groups. So the Pueblo people typically would trade, especially with groups like Apache. But when times were lean, they had to use what they had and what they had from storage to feed their own people. Well, the Apache at this time, of course, the Apache culture is very centered on hunting and gathering. Well, you can't gather anything because the drought, nothing's growing. And then also the game is starting to move on and starting to be very scarce and hide in the best ways possible. Animals are very cunning like that. So the Apache folks are faced with a decision. They either feed their own people or they take what they need. So oftentimes the Pueblo people, which did not have much of a military infrastructure, definitely nothing to compete with that of what the Apache had, a lot of the trading would turn to raiding in certain times. So the Pueblo people and the Spaniards alike are facing an increase in pressure at this time. And then of course you also have the Spanish and other native groups that are capturing Apache people and utilizing them for labor. And you have a lot of atrocities that are being slung back and forth between the groups. So you see an increase in hostility between people when times are scarce. Which you see that in American culture too, in the era of good feelings. The economy was great, people were excited and wanted to work together, but in tough times you start to see the opposite. So very similar, it's a human quality. So all hands on deck. So the Franciscans, they did give their best effort to salvage the missions and the people. So the missions had large gardens, as I referenced before. They grew all different types of crops. And at places like Pueblo, you had a surplus every year. So you either sold some of that surplus or you stored it. Well, the Franciscans sort of prepared for some of these lean times, so they stored quite a bit of what they didn't use. So from May to September of 1672, Fray Avila of Abo, he gave it his best effort. He gave 4,466 pounds of corn, 12 cows, 37 sheep for food, 605 pounds of corn for planting, and 250 sheep to use for wool for clothing and needy families within the Pueblo he released from the mission storage. Avila also outfitted the Spanish military, which is a little ironic, and you're going to see in the next slide, but he supplied them with 990 pounds of wheat, 84 pounds of beans, and 21 sheep. Avila stated in 1672, referencing their reasoning for preparation, all of which I have sought after and obtained for the love of God, aided only by the religious of the conventos, and especially our most revered father custodian. So he was preparing for this drought, and he knew he had to use what he could until he couldn't give any more, and that's really what the case was in the region. So church and state tensions, territorial governor's authority. So this is what the territorial governor that sat in Santa Fe had the power to do. Issue ordinances and decrees, supervise the government in Santa Fe, select new sites for settlement, supervise the assignment of land and water rights, maintain and build roads, command military force, which they paid these men through encomiendas. So encomiendas was the type of ownership system that was in place, more a labor system in place here in the territories. So they would grant an encomienda to certain landowners in the region, and they would have a right to tax certain pueblos. They usually would tax them weavings or pottery or corn, and in return, the encomendero had mandatory military service for the territorial militia. So they had a vested interest with the government. And then the territorial governor could divide the province into lesser administrative districts, assigned an alcides mayor or chief judge for each. This one's going to be important as we get to the home stretch of the mission system. So tension arose in that judicial authority overlapping with Franciscan principles. The governor had direct judicial authority over cases of military discipline, sedition, questions of encomiendas, Indian relations, cases appealed to the magistrates of Santa Fe, and in cases referred from other jurisdictions throughout the province. The actual forming of these jurisdictions did not happen until the 1650s, most likely. Due to the decentralizing population of Santa Fe, so people were starting to phase out of that Santa Fe, and they settled down from Santa Fe into these fringe regions. And then prior to this change, the church exercised ecclesiastical justice in these regions, so church crime, basically. So following the morals and principles of the Franciscan order, or else you would be punished through judicial, or through, well, I guess it would be church judicial law. And that stretched in these rural areas before the government had any sort of alcides mayor or representative to these areas. We were one of them, the Salinas jurisdiction. The reorganization strengthened the reach of the power of the government while simultaneously pulled power from the church, who in the Spanish system of government is a co-equal entity. You have the crown over here, and you have the church right here with a straight line from the king to the pope. So in their system, they are equal. They are equal powers that be. So that's the way the Spanish government is set up, which starts to backfire in this case. Retaliation against the state. The Franciscans believed they could demand physical labor from Pueblo people without a payment if they couldn't pay their taxes to the encomendero. So they felt they could inflict physical punishment for disobeying Catholic laws. In particular, one woman received 4 lashes for adultery at Guarani. So you see them start to exercise what they feel judicial authority and punish them for crimes of the church, and then you start to see some harsh treatment towards the people for doing so. They're taking the law into their own hand. So the state believed the Pueblo people were subject to civil law, and the church had no legal authority over them. This push and pull from both sides, they were pulling on each other, but left in the middle of it were the Pueblo people. And they were being, coerced to do something in one way or the other way in favor of one group or the other group. Well, and the Pueblo people, they're just sort of trying to stick around and advance like they did prior to Spanish contact. Additional strain. Starting in 1661, the Franciscans began filling in the kivas, so this late 50s, early 60s, they start phasing out of that dual spiritual ceremony system that they had prior to. They banned traditional kiva ceremonies, and to this point, kiva and churches, as I mentioned, coexisted in a sort of blended religion style. In April 1661, in Isleta, Fray Posadas confiscated all Kachina masks and figures. At Gran Quivira, all 7 of the excavated kivas that were active during the 1660s were destroyed and filled in with fill and refuse. And then you see an abrupt migration. So we talked about all these factors that are straining every person that's living in this region. The drought, the tension between the church and state, the lack of food and the pressure from groups that are from outside the area. At Gran Quivira, the migration at Gran Quivira began with an attack from Apache in 1670, which led to large-scale damage and burning of the Pueblo. Families scattered, and the mission was abandoned by 1671 completely. And most people left completely by 1672, and it began by 1671. Abo, the convento, was completely burned by the Tompuro in 1672, and there were increased pressure from raiding Plains group for Tompuro, causing Tompuro to migrate by 1675. Now, Quorai is a little bit of a different story. So, Fray Perea closed the doors in 1677, so it held on the longest. The Franciscans and the Tiwa people moved together to Tahique, and then they both moved to Isleta by 1679 to 1678. And then at the outbreak of the Pueblo Revolt, a good portion of the people at Quorai migrated and fled with the Spanish down to El Paso. And there they formed the new mission in Pueblo of Isleta del Sur, which is still there to this day. Cultures continue. So just because there was this abrupt migration of these people persevered, and they're still here today, and they're still living in our tribal communities, and they're still creating and doing contemporary things, and they're still producing and evolving as we all. It was not until the 19th century, though, when families started calling the Estancia Basin home again. We saw resettlers come in the 1800s. We see Mexican settlers, American settlers, Plains natives, Pueblo people alike, rediscovering an area that was seemingly lost in time. It was uninhabited to that point, just by travelers. So today, we see these cultures rooted in the fabric of our art, our food, religion, and more. Learning from those mistakes in the past and embracing those cultural differences will continue to make New Mexico that wonderful blend of cultural traditions that we are here. So and if anybody's curious about some of the sources, talk to me afterwards. I'll get you my source slide. And that's all. Does anybody I'll open the floor to some questions. Ann in the back.
Yeah, so nobody lived here for 100 years in the 1700s?
Yes, no. So we have accounts from travelers that came through the area. So Quorai was visited, and for a brief time occupied by Spanish military, roughly during the Reconquest era into the early 1700s. The friars, after the Pueblo Revolt, so the post-Pueblo Revolt churches, came back to look for the body of Fray Geronimo, because it was supposedly buried within the base of the altar table. The altar table was still there, and the Franciscans that came back destroyed it. Unfortunately, it was still intact. And then they thought maybe it was buried underneath, and they looked underneath, and the body was not there. And come to realize, some local testimony said that the body was taken with them when they went to Tahique, and it was buried there. So really, the only accounts that we have are from traveling groups of people. The Abo sees a little bit more people because Abo Pass was still traveled by Plains folks, by the Apache and by the Umano people. And there's evidence of burning that happened at both Abo and Quorai from people during that era. And the first resettlement happens around 1815 with the establishment of the Manzano land grant, which that's when you get resettlement at Quorai, and then you get resettlement at Abo, which is just outside the land grant. That era of resettlement only lasted at Abo until 1830, and then this was still tough country. There were still groups of people that were hostile to folks that were settling here. So they were chased back to the Rio Grande. They did not return to Abo until the late 1860s, roughly 68, 69. At Quorai, the people were chased out in 1830. They actually started building a second church at Quorai. And you'll see when you're walking the interpretive path, Maybe just, I don't know, 50 yards down the trail, you'll look to the left and you'll see the foundation of this small church. Well, archaeologists originally thought that that might have been an original mission church, but the early archaeology at Pueblo was done in 1913. There were people that still remembered that church being built and their parents and working on that church. So they vividly remember that that was not there. And of course, the archaeology told the real story in the end. So that church was being built in 1829, and then in May of 1830, there was an attack that killed roughly 6 or 7 settlers from the Apache that were traveling through the area. And then they retreated to Manzano Way and Grant proper, where the town of Manzano is today. And then you'll see the mission church in Manzano, or the Catholic church that's in Manzano that still sits there today. That is the product of what was going to be at Quarai again. So really, you had no permanent resettlement until you get to about 1830. And it was just used by travelers that were coming through the area and plains people that were in the area. Yes?
You mentioned that Abo originally had a church that went with a town of about 500 people.
Yes.
But what was it, about 20 years later, Abo had 1,400 or
Yes.
60? How do you account for that huge difference in population?
So, if you remember in the slides, I referenced the excess of goods that the friar was expelling from the storage.
Yeah.
There was really successful farming at Abo. Abo has a spring, a natural spring that I've never seen it dry. It could potentially go dry, but I've never seen it dry. So they had a sustainable water source. The Spanish introduced acequia farming, which is needed for the apple orchards that they have there. Sort of similar to the way that pecan trees are grown or chili is grown. If you go down to the Las Cruces area, you'll see very little water in the Rio Grande, but a lot of water in the green fields. They're diverting that water away from the spring source or the river source in that case. So they had successful farming at Abo, and of course, once you get into the later years, that population will start to dwindle in the 60s and 70s, but we really don't have numbers from that time. But at the peak, it had roughly 1,400 people, as evidenced by the trash piles, by the span of the pueblos that were there, and by the friar referencing the population.
Do we have any evidence as to whether those people voluntarily went there or were brought there?
No evidence of anything forced. When you think about it, I mentioned the cultural borrowing from the Pueblo people and the Mogollon people and sort of their own people. When the Spanish first arrived here, another thing to take into account, they're only coming, there's only a few. You're probably only having about 50 rough number of people that are associated with Spain or Mexico at the time, once you get later with Spain, that are involved in a mission operation, and then you have a few fringe settlements that are around. You have that amount of people, and then you have 1,400 native people that have their own warriors. So at the time, when the Spanish first arrived, they have things to share. So they're sharing medical tools, they're sharing new crops that they've never seen, they're sharing livestock, they're sharing horses, and things that the Pueblo people, even to this day, still actually, they hold very culturally close to them, like horses, apples. I mentioned turkey, but they already had turkey at that point. But they also bring different styles of building. So the Spanish introduced a scaffolding system and a pulley system to lift roof beams up. So they're showing these new techniques. So at first, you could only, with no signs or evidence that there was any forced labor or forced captivity of people, you venture to believe that the Pueblo people thought they were doing what they always do, is culturally borrowing and sharing back and forth between the new people that arrive. I always like to bring up the hindsight is 2020. They could not see down the road of what the ultimate goal was. And I always explain that two groups, I mentioned at the beginning, this is a human story. Two groups with two different mind frames of how the world operates. So you have the Spanish, that all they had to do to own this land was make a land claim. They did what they needed to do to be observed by other European countries and other nations across the world. So in their mind, this is their property. You have the Pueblo people that have really always been here, but they've migrated to the area when nobody else was living there, and they truly made a land claim. But in their mind, they're living amongst the land. You know, they have their home bases, but they're living with the land. So the Spanish people, their goal with the mission system is to integrate people into the Spanish way of life by showing them new techniques and new worship styles, etc. The Pueblo people, their mind frame is most likely that people want to trade or people want to coexist with us here, that these are new people, that we could get something from them and then we could get something in return. So you have people that have two opposite mind frames of how the world operates. So you're starting right off the bat with a misunderstanding. We do see evidence of the Spanish government utilizing the natives in this area for labor. So when the territorial capital was being set up in Santa Fe, we know they came down and utilized the natives in this region. When one of the governors, the specific ones, his name's escaping me, but he really enjoyed pinon nuts and selling pinon nuts. So he utilized Tompiro and a bow to pick pinon nuts and collect them, and then he could sell them. So a lot of the labor, and then of course the encomienda system, which is a government-run initiative, a lot of the labor comes in, forced labor from the Spanish. Whereas the Franciscans, yeah, there were people tending to the gardens, but the Pueblo people were eating the same food as well. So there was a lot of cultural borrowing that happened between the Spanish and Franciscans. And of course, the Franciscans are operating on that mindset that, yeah, we'll listen to this, but here's what you're going to have to end up doing in the end. So different trains of thought.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious about the experience of some of these Franciscan friars. They come to this new land. They are in charge of building a city basically there, and they've got such limited supplies and tools. What kind of experience do these people have?
Yeah.
I mean, they had to be engineers, they had to be
Yeah.
city planners, everything.
Yeah, everything, all at one, right? So all of the friars came from Spain or Portugal in this area. They were all educated and brought over from Spain or Portugal. There were no completely Mexican-born Franciscan friars at this point. Later on, it's a different story. So Acevedo is the best example I could give. He was the friar at Abo for about 30 years, and he was the friar that was there during that huge population increase that the Pueblo had seen. He's part of the building of two churches. He is not the guardian of Abo or the main friar at Abo when Gran Quivira, when the first church is being built there, but he is a sort of an assistant friar, lay brother that just became a friar. He is one of those. So he helps with the building and completion of that first church at Gran Quivira. And then he also builds, of course, the second church at Abo that I was mentioning. He was around during that first church that was built at Abo. So he had his hand in, a few different aspects or a few different building projects. He designed that Abo church unlike any other. He didn't just take a standard blueprint. He designed it to where the first church sat within that footprint and they could worship in the other church simultaneously while they were building the second church. They expanded the apse and then just knocked in the apse, and there you go. So he very much had an architecturally based mind. He had an agrarian mind by being able to bring in that system of farming, but no doubt he had people to help him. And most of these fringe settlers that are coming from Santa Fe down are wanting to settle. They had estancias or ranches that were near the missions and the pueblos because that's where your population was. If you needed something, you can go down to the mission and buy a bushel of wheat or whatever you needed. So they were businessmen too. They did a little bit of everything. And then you start to see in the later era, you start to see civilians that are hanging around and being hired by the church to do certain educations or schools or whatnot. So So yeah, the missions, the population centers were the Pueblos. That's what was there, and then the missions followed suit. They kind of went to where the cluster of people were, and then the settlers came and clustered even more, so that you had micro cities. You know, today, if you go down to Gran Quivira, you're steeped in silence. You may be the only people at Gran Quivira, and it's quiet and you hear the birds. But you know, if you were standing in that village in the 1630s, there could be 3,000 people there. You would hear flute music, you would hear corn grinding, you would hear people making pottery and singing and chatter, gossip, whatever you want. You would hear it all. So today it's almost hard to imagine that, but these really were city centers, and there were upwards between 30 and 40,000 people living or ranging through this central New Mexico area once you get around the 1600s. So there were quite a lot of people, more than now, probably, if you add up all the towns.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, other questions? Yes?
Was there any written language, or is all of this discovered through geographical evidence?
No written language. So Tom Piro does not have a written language. And unfortunately, most of that language is not spoken anymore. But there's a certain amount of words. There's still tribal connection and tribal affiliation to the Abo site, to the people that settled there. And they, I believe, articulate certain Tompiro words. That's what makes Pueblo language so difficult. Tiwa, of course, stood the test of time. So when Pueblo people would migrate, they would bring a multitude of things with them. Pottery, building knowledge, building style knowledge, artwork, pottery with the artwork on the pottery. They'd bring a lot of stuff with them. They wouldn't bring their language. They would learn new language. So a lot of these languages, because people were consolidating due to resource starvation, pressure from outside groups, whatever the case may be, they were learning new language. So Tompiro and Piro are languages that are not spoken anymore widely, but Tiwa is very, very widely spoken. In Isleta, Taos, Sandia, speak Tiwa. Other questions? I think Miss Donna might be giving me the boot here. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody here. Thank you to MMAC. They're always good partners for us to work with, and we like to work together on a multitude of community events throughout the year. So if any of you are local, keep an eye out on their calendar, on their website, as well as Parks calendar, Facebook page, everything like that. And we will have events throughout the year down here. Some a little bit more fun maybe than the one that we had today. You might learn less but have more fun. But it depends on what your mind thinks. But I think this is fun. But they're always a gracious partner of us. And then also on behalf of the National Park Service, we'd like to thank you all for coming out and for being such a good audience. Thank you.
I just want to thank everyone for coming today. Remember, this is where people can come and we can do amazing, amazing things. Dances, if you have suggestions of something you would like to see as a community member, come to us, talk to us, tell us what you want. I will tell you what I want. And I want volunteers here. So if you're bored with being home, come on down. We got stuff that you can do. Thank you very much. Don't leave without taking cookies. I'm not bringing them home.
I know it. I was freaking out.